The sound of shattering glass cut through the morning air like a scream. I stood frozen in the doorway of my childhood bedroom, watching Victoria Hayes methodically destroy the last pieces of my mother Carmen's jewelry collection. Each delicate necklace, each precious ring that had once graced my mother's fingers, was being crushed under the heel of my stepmother's designer shoe with calculated precision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria, what are you doing? The words escaped my throat in barely a whisper, but she heard them. She turned toward me with that cold smile I'd grown to recognize over the past 3 years since she'd married my father Thomas. Her perfectly manicured hand held my mother's pearl bracelet, the one Carmen had worn on her wedding day 28 years ago. Oh, Elena, perfect timing. Victoria's voice dripped with false sweetness. I was just cleaning out some old clutter. Your father finally agreed it was time to let go of the past and make room for our future together. She dangled the pearl bracelet in front of me like a taunt. These old trinkets were just collecting dust anyway. Nothing valuable, just costume jewelry and sentimental nonsense. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched her drop the bracelet onto the hardwood floor. The pearls scattered like tiny tears across the room, each one representing a memory of my mother that Victoria was systematically erasing. I wanted to scream, to rush forward and gather every broken piece, but something in her expression warned me that any reaction would only fuel her satisfaction. Those belonged to my mother, I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. She left them to me. Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Your mother has been gone for 5 years, dear. It's time you learned to live in the present instead of clinging to ghosts. She gestured around the room where fragments of gold chains, broken earrings, and scattered gemstones created a graveyard of memories. Besides, Thomas and I need the space. We're converting this room into a home office. The cruelty was breathtaking in its casualness. This wasn't just about jewelry or space. This was about erasing Carmen Martinez from her own home, removing any trace that she had ever existed, ever been loved, ever mattered. Victoria had been working toward this moment since the day she'd moved into our West Hills house, slowly poisoning my father's memories and turning him against anything that reminded him of his first wife. I knelt down and carefully picked up one of the scattered pearls, rolling it between my fingers. It was warm, as if it still held some essence of my mother's touch. I'll clean this up, I said quietly, not trusting myself to look at Victoria directly. Don't bother, cleaning service will handle it. Victoria checked her watch, a diamond-encrusted Rolex that probably cost more than most people made in a year. I have a spa appointment, and tonight we're having dinner with the Richardsons. Important people, Elena. The kind of social connections your father needs to maintain his reputation in this city. The implication hung heavy in the air. Unlike you, the implication said. Unlike your mother, who was just a school teacher from a middle-class family. Unlike the daughter who never quite fit into Portland's elite social circles, the way Victoria did with her perfectly curated background and connections. After Victoria left, I spent the next 2 hours on my hands and knees gathering every fragment I could find. Each piece told a story. The silver locket that had been my grandmother's. The emerald ring my mother had saved for 3 years to buy herself as a celebration when she'd gotten her master's degree. The simple gold wedding band that had symbolized 23 years of love between my parents. Some pieces were beyond repair, crushed so thoroughly that they were nothing but glittering dust. Others might be salvageable if I could find the right jeweler, someone skilled enough to restore what Victoria had tried to destroy. I placed everything carefully in a shoebox, treating each fragment like the precious memory it represented. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Natasha Kim. Coffee later, you sound stressed from your last message. I had texted her earlier, a brief message about Victoria's latest campaign to erase my mother from our home. Natasha had been my anchor through the worst of it. The one person who remembered Carmen Martinez as she really was, not the diminished version Victoria had created in my father's mind. I drove to our usual spot in the Pearl District, a small cafe that served the kind of simple, honest food my mother would have loved. Natasha was already waiting, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her expression concerned as she watched me approach with the shoebox clutched against my chest. Elena, you look like you haven't slept in days. Natasha stood to hug me, careful not to jostle the box. What happened this time? I told her everything, about finding Victoria in my room, about the systematic destruction, about the casual cruelty with which she'd dismissed my mother's memory. Natasha listened with the kind of focused attention that reminded me why we'd been friends since high school, why she was one of the few people who truly understood what I'd lost when Carmen died. That woman is a monster, Natasha said when I finished. Have you talked to your father? I laughed bitterly. My father hasn't really talked to me since he married Victoria. Not about anything that matters. He's convinced himself that moving on means pretending the past never existed. Every time I try to bring up my mother, he changes the subject or finds an excuse to leave the room. Thomas Hayes had once been my hero, a successful architect who had built his firm from nothing. He had loved my mother with the kind of devotion that made their friends joke about them being sickening. But grief had changed him, made him vulnerable to Victoria's particular brand of manipulation. She had presented herself as his salvation, the woman who would help him forget his pain by forgetting the source of it entirely. "There has to be something we can do," Natasha said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "This isn't just about jewelry, Elena. This is about your heritage, your connection to your mother. Victoria has no right to destroy that." I opened the shoebox carefully, showing Natasha the fragments inside. Some pieces were more intact than others, but even the broken ones held weight in my palm, substance that spoke to their quality. "I keep thinking there's something I'm missing. My mother was careful with money, practical about everything, but she always said these pieces were special, that they had stories." Natasha lifted a delicate chain that had somehow survived Victoria's rampage, mostly intact. "This workmanship is beautiful. Look at these settings, this attention to detail. Your mother had exquisite taste." "She did, but we never had much money. Dad's firm was just getting started when they got married, and Mom was teaching elementary school. They saved for everything, planned every purchase." I touched the broken clasp of what had been an intricate silver bracelet. "I always assumed these were nice pieces, but not particularly valuable. Sentimental value, you know. Maybe you should have them appraised," Natasha suggested. "Even the broken pieces. If nothing else, you'll have documentation of what Victoria destroyed. That might be important if you ever decide to take legal action." The idea hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. At minimum, an appraisal would give me a record of what had been lost, something concrete to show my father when I finally found the courage to confront him about what his wife had done. At best, it might reveal something about my mother's jewelry that I'd never known. "Do you know anyone who does appraisals?" I asked. "Actually, yes. My cousin works in insurance, and she's always talking about this appraiser she works with for estate claims. Let me text her." Natasha pulled out her phone, fingers flying over the screen. "His name is Detective Ryan Cooper. He's retired police, but he specializes in jewelry appraisal and investigation, handles a lot of estate disputes and insurance cases." A detective? Something about that felt right, like the universe was pointing me toward answers I didn't even know I was looking for. "Can you get his contact information?" "Already on it." Natasha's phone chimed with a response. "Here we go. Detective Cooper. His office is downtown, near Pioneer Courthouse Square. My cousin says he's thorough, honest, and he's seen everything. If there's more to your mother's jewelry than meets the eye, he'll find it." I made the appointment for the following morning, despite the voice in my head that warned me I was opening a door I might not be able to close. There was something about the way Victoria had acted, the specific cruelty of her timing and methods, that made me think this wasn't random spite. This felt calculated, like she had been waiting for the right moment to destroy something she knew was important. That night, I sat in my small apartment in downtown Portland, carefully cleaning each salvageable piece of jewelry with a soft cloth and warm water. The work was meditative, almost like a ritual of remembrance. As I cleaned, I found myself thinking about my mother in ways I hadn't allowed myself to in years. Carmen Martinez had been a woman of quiet strength and hidden depths. She spoke 3 languages fluently but never made others feel small for their limitations. She could stretch a grocery budget to feed a family for a week, but she also had an eye for beauty that showed in everything from the way she arranged flowers to the clothes she chose. She had never been flashy or obvious about anything, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. So why would a woman like that accumulate jewelry that was now worth having appraised by a detective? What stories had these pieces held that I'd never thought to ask about? And why had Victoria been so determined to destroy them now, after 3 years of marriage to my father? I fell asleep that night with the clean jewelry arranged on my bedside table, each piece catching the light from the street lamp outside my window. In my dreams, my mother was wearing her pearl bracelet, smiling at me with that gentle expression that had always made me feel safe. When I woke, the pearls were scattered again, as if Victoria's destruction had followed me even into sleep. The next morning, I dressed carefully in the kind of professional outfit my mother would have approved of. Navy blue dress, simple jewelry, hair pulled back neat. I wanted to approach this appraisal with dignity, to honor Carmen's memory by presenting her possessions with the respect they deserve. Detective Cooper's office was located in a converted warehouse in southeast Portland, the kind of building that spoke to Portland's industrial past, while embracing its artistic present. The space was clean and professional, with display cases full of various jewelry pieces and certificates on the walls that spoke to Cooper's credentials and experience. The man himself was different from what I'd expected. Late 50s, graying hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glass. He had the sort of steady presence that probably served him well as both a police officer and someone who dealt with people during emotional times, involving precious possessions. "Miss Martinez," he said, standing to shake my hand, "I understand you have some pieces you'd like appraised. Please have a seat and tell me what brings you here." I explained the situation as objectively as I could manage, focusing on facts rather than emotions. My mother had passed 5 years ago, leaving her jewelry collection to me. My stepmother had recently destroyed most of the pieces during what she claimed was a cleaning session, but I wanted to document what had been lost, and possibly restore what could be saved. Detective Cooper listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "I see this type of situation more often than you might think. Family dynamics around inherited jewelry can be quite complex. May I see what you've brought?" I opened the shoebox carefully, arranging the pieces on the velvet-lined tray he provided. Some fragments, some intact pieces, some that were bent or damaged but still recognizable. Cooper examined each piece with a jeweler's loupe, making notes on a pad as he worked. "Miss Martinez," he said after several minutes of careful examination, looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Where did you say your mother acquired these pieces?" "Over the years, I think. She and my father saved for special occasions." "Why?" Cooper held up what remained of the emerald ring, turning it carefully in the light. "This setting is quite unusual. The workmanship suggests European origin, possibly mid-20th century. These emeralds are of exceptional quality, and this design is characteristic of a particular period and region." He set the ring down and picked up another fragment. "And this piece here, what's left of this brooch, shows similar characteristics. The metalwork is distinct." Something in his tone made my pulse quicken. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'd like to do some research before I complete this appraisal. These pieces share certain characteristics that I'd like to investigate further. Would you be comfortable leaving them with me for a few days? I have a secure safe, and I'll provide you with a detailed receipt." I hesitated for only a moment. Something about Detective Cooper inspired trust, and I sensed that he had recognized something in my mother's jewelry that I had missed entirely. "Yes, I think that would be fine. But can you give me any idea of what you're thinking?" Cooper smiled, but it was the kind of smile that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "Let me do my research first, Miss Martinez. But I will tell you this, your instinct to have these pieces appraised was a very good one. I suspect your mother's jewelry collection has stories to tell that go far beyond their sentimental value." I left Detective Cooper's office with more questions than answers, but for the first time since Victoria's destruction of my mother's jewelry, I felt something other than grief and anger. I felt hope. There was a mystery here, something Cooper had recognized immediately that had escaped me entirely. Whatever he discovered in his research might not bring back the pieces Victoria had destroyed, but it might reveal truths about my mother that I had never known. As I drove back through Portland's familiar streets, I found myself seeing the city differently. The Pearl District where I lived, the West Hills where I'd grown up, the Southeast neighborhoods where immigrants had built communities and businesses, all of it seemed connected to something larger than I'd understood. My mother had moved to Portland from California when she'd married my father, but she'd never talked much about her life before their marriage, before me. Now I wondered what stories Carmen Martinez had brought with her to Oregon, what histories were embedded in the jewelry she'd collected so carefully over the years. Victoria had tried to erase those stories, but Detective Cooper's reaction suggested that some truths were harder to destroy than she'd imagined. That afternoon I called in sick to my job at the marketing firm where I worked. I needed time to think, to process what Cooper had seen in my mother's jewelry that I had missed. I spent the day in my apartment, going through the few photos and documents my mother had left behind, looking for clues I might have overlooked. Most of her personal papers were straightforward: teaching certificates, medical records, correspondence with friends, but at the bottom of an old jewelry box that had survived Victoria's purge, I found something I'd forgotten existed: a small leather journal, written in my mother's careful handwriting. The entries were brief, mostly notes about daily life, but scattered throughout were references to pieces of jewelry. "Received the emerald ring today. Min says it belonged to her grandmother, that it has been in the family for generations. Such a beautiful piece, and such a sad story." Another entry, dated 2 years later: "The broker in San Francisco finally located the matching earrings. They cost more than we can afford, but some things are worth the sacrifice." A broker in San Francisco, matching earrings to what? I read more carefully, finding references to dealers, estate sales, and specific pieces that I recognized from my mother's collection. This wasn't the casual jewelry shopping I'd imagined. This was systematic, purposeful collecting, as if my mother had been searching for specific pieces with particular significance. One entry, dated just a year before my mother's death, made me catch my breath. Elena will understand someday. These pieces tell a story that can't be lost. These suspects something, keeps asking questions about the collection. I need to make sure Elena knows the truth before it's too late. The Victoria, my mother had known, even then, that her jewelry collection was at risk. She'd been trying to protect something, to preserve some truth that Victoria threatened. But what truth? What story was so important that my mother had spent years and significant money assembling these particular pieces? My phone rang, startling me from my reading. It was Detective Cooper. Ms. Martinez, I hope you don't mind me calling so soon, but I've made some interesting discoveries in my initial research. Would you be available to come in tomorrow morning? I think you're going to want to hear what I've found. Can you give me any hint? Cooper paused and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Let me ask you this. Did your mother ever mention anything about her family's history during World War II? The question hit me like a physical blow. World War II? No, never. She was born in. Her parents came to California after the war, but she never talked about that time. I see. Well, Miss Martinez, I think tomorrow's conversation is going to change your understanding of your mother's jewelry collection quite significantly. Shall we say 10 o'clock? After he hung up, I sat staring at my mother's journal, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in my mind. A collection assembled purposefully over decades. A woman who saved every penny but spent significant money on specific pieces. References to dealers and brokers and family histories. And now Detective Cooper connecting it all to World War II, to events my mother had never discussed but that had apparently shaped her entire adult life. Victoria had tried to destroy more than jewelry. She had tried to erase a history, a legacy that connected my mother to events and people I'd never known existed. But some stories, I was beginning to understand, are too important to be silenced by spite and ignorance. Tomorrow I would learn what Detective Cooper had discovered. Tonight I would read every page of my mother's journal, searching for clues about the woman I thought I'd known and the secrets she'd been protecting. The pearls scattered across my childhood bedroom floor had been more than memory. They had been breadcrumbs leading to a truth that Victoria Hayes had never wanted me to discover. But truth, like love, has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at destruction. And I was finally ready to learn what my mother had been trying to tell me all along. The morning fog hung low over downtown Portland as I walked into Detective Cooper's office at exactly 10 o'clock. I had spent the entire night reading my mother's journal, uncovering references to names I'd never heard, places she'd never mentioned, and a systematic search for jewelry pieces that seemed to follow some invisible pattern I couldn't decipher. Cooper greeted me with a gravity I hadn't seen during our first meeting. His desk was covered with papers, photographs and what appeared to be historical documents. Several reference books lay open, their pages marked with sticky notes and annotations. Miss Martinez, please sit down. What I'm about to share with you will likely come as a shock. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, then pulled out a thick folder. After examining your mother's jewelry yesterday, I contacted several colleagues who specialize in wartime artifact recovery. The pieces you brought me aren't just valuable, Elena. They're historically significant. He opened the folder and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the desk to me. It was a black and white image of a woman in her 30s, elegant and poised, wearing what I immediately recognized as my mother's emerald ring and matching necklace. This photograph was taken in Vienna in 1943. The woman wearing your mother's jewelry is Rosa Goldstein, a Jewish art dealer who was forced to flee Austria when the Nazis began confiscating Jewish-owned businesses and personal property. My hands trembled as I held the photograph. The woman looked remarkably like my mother, the same delicate bone structure, the same intelligent eyes. I don't understand, how did my mother get Rosa's jewelry? Cooper pulled out another document, this one more recent. Rosa Goldstein was your mother's great. She managed to smuggle some of her most precious pieces out of Vienna before the family was separated. The jewelry was hidden with trusted friends, eventually making its way to America through a network of refugees and sympathizers. The room seemed to tilt around me. My mother had never mentioned any relatives in Europe, never spoken about the war or family connections to that terrible time. Yet here was proof that Carmen Martinez had been carrying forward a legacy she'd never shared with me. There's more, Cooper said gently. Rosa's collection wasn't just personal jewelry. She had been hiding pieces for other Jewish families, friends and customers who trusted her to preserve their valuables when they couldn't take them during their escape attempts. What your mother assembled over the years wasn't random collecting. She was reuniting a scattered collection that represented dozens of families torn apart by the war. He showed me page after page of documentation, lists of missing artifacts, survivor testimonies, insurance claims that had never been settled. Each piece of my mother's jewelry appeared somewhere in these records, connected to stories of loss, hope, and survival that spanned continents and decades. How did my mother know about all this? I asked, struggling to process the magnitude of what Cooper was revealing. That's what I wanted to ask you. These pieces didn't just happen to come together. Someone with extensive knowledge of the original collection had to be orchestrating their recovery. Your mother wasn't just collecting jewelry, Elena. She was conducting her own private restitution effort. I thought about the journal entries I'd read, the references to brokers and dealers, the careful notation of each acquisition. My mother had been carrying out a mission she'd never explained, following clues and connections that had taken her years to piece together. But why didn't she tell me? Why keep it secret? Cooper's expression darkened. Because collections like this are worth millions of dollars, and there are people who would do anything to get their hands on them. Not just for the monetary value, but because they represent evidence of war crimes, of theft on a massive scale. There are still Nazi sympathizers and treasure hunters who actively search for collections like Rosa's. The words hit me like ice water. You think Victoria knew? I think Victoria suspected your mother's jewelry was more than it appeared to be. Her decision to destroy the collection wasn't random spite, Elena. It was calculated elimination of evidence. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the busy Portland street. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my mother's quiet life as a teacher, was crumbling. Carmen Martinez had been living a double life, carrying forward a mission of justice and remembrance while teaching second graders to read. There's something else you need to know, Cooper. I ran a background check on Victoria Hayes after our conversation yesterday. Her maiden name was Victoria Schmidt. Her grandfather, Klaus Schmidt, worked for the Nazi regime during the war, specifically in the division responsible for confiscating Jewish property. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I couldn't immediately process it. My father had married the granddaughter of a Nazi, a woman whose family had participated in the very crimes my mother had spent her life trying to address. And Victoria had known. She had recognized the significance of my mother's collection, and had systematically worked to destroy it. Does my father know any of this? I doubt it. Victoria has been very careful to construct a false identity. She's presented herself as coming from an old American family, but the documentation I found suggests she's actually first-generation German-American. Her grandfather immigrated to the United States after the war under a false identity. I sank back into my chair, overwhelmed by the implication. So when she destroyed my mother's jewelry, she was continuing her grandfather's work, finishing what he started. That's how I see it. And I suspect she's been planning this for a long time. Her marriage to your father, her gradual isolation of you from family decisions, her systematic erasure of your mother's memory. None of it was coincidental. Cooper opened another folder, this one containing legal documents. Elena, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound unbelievable, but bear with me. The jewelry your mother collected represents one of the largest recovered Nazi-looted art collections discovered in the past 50 years. The pieces that survived Victoria's destruction are worth approximately $12 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $12 million. My mother, who had clipped coupons and saved every penny, who had driven the same car for 15 years and mended clothes instead of buying new ones, had been the guardian of a $12 million collection of stolen art and jewelry. But it's not about the money, I said, and Cooper nodded approvingly. Exactly, it's about justice. It's about families who never knew what happened to their grandmother's wedding rings, their father's watches, their children's jewelry. Your mother was trying to return these pieces to their rightful owners or their descendants. He pulled out a thick binder filled with photographs and documents. I've been in contact with several international organizations that track wartime stolen property. They've been looking for Rosa Goldstein's collection for over 70 years. The families represented by these pieces, the survivors and their children and grandchildren, they never stopped hoping that someday their family treasures would be found. I thought about my mother's journal, her careful records and cryptic notes. She was planning to return them, wasn't she? That's why she kept such detailed records. I believe so, but she needed time to verify provenance, to locate the rightful owners, to ensure the pieces went to the correct families. It's incredibly complex work, requiring years of research and international cooperation. The magnitude of my mother's secret mission was staggering. While teaching children and maintaining a normal family life, she had been conducting her own war crimes investigation, working to heal wounds that were decades old. What happens now? Cooper closed the folders and looked at me directly. That depends on you, Elena. Legally, you inherited your mother's collection, which means you now own some of the most significant recovered war artifacts in recent history. You could sell them and become incredibly wealthy. You could donate them to museums, or you could continue your mother's work and help return them to their rightful families. The choice felt enormous, weighted with the hopes and tragedies of people I'd never met. Families scattered across the globe by one of history's greatest evils. But as I sat there, I knew there was really no choice at all. My mother had spent years of her life trying to right historical wrongs. I couldn't betray that mission now. I want to continue what she started. I want to return the pieces to their family. Cooper smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since this revelation began. I hoped you'd say that. I've already reached out to the International Commission on Holocaust-era Insurance Claims. They're prepared to work with us on identifying and contacting the families represented by your mother's collection. He handed me another document, this one bearing official letterheads and seals. There's also this. The German government has a restitution program for wartime stolen property. When pieces are returned to families, they often provide financial compensation to the person who facilitated the return. In your case, that compensation would likely be substantial. So there would be money after all, but money earned through justice rather than sale. Money that came with the knowledge that families had been reunited with their heritage. It felt right in a way that simply selling the collection never could have. But Elena, Cooper's voice grew serious again. You need to understand that this puts you in considerable danger. Victoria destroyed what she could find, but she doesn't know about the pieces that survive. When word gets out about this collection, when the international media picks up the story, she's going to realize that her plan failed. And people who carry on their grandfather's Nazi missions don't give up easily. The threat was real and immediate. Victoria had already shown herself capable of calculated cruelty. If she learned that her destruction had been incomplete, that I was now working to expose not just the collection, but her own family's war crimes, there was no telling how far she might go to protect herself. I need to tell my father, I said. He deserves to know who he married. I agree, but we need to be strategic about how and when you approach him. Victoria has had 3 years to manipulate his perceptions, to isolate him from anything that might contradict her version of reality. If you confront him directly, she might convince him you're having some kind of breakdown, that you're creating elaborate fantasies about your mother's jewelry. Cooper was right. My father's transformation over the past 3 years, his gradual withdrawal from me and his willingness to let Victoria erase my mother's memory, suggested that her influence over him was profound. A direct confrontation might backfire, might drive him further into Victoria's web of lies. What do you suggest? Documentation first. We need to build an undeniable case, something so comprehensive that Victoria can't dismiss it as fantasy or delusion. I want to invite representatives from the Holocaust Claims Commission to Portland. I want museum experts to examine and authenticate the pieces. I want media documentation of the entire process. He pulled out a business card and handed it to me. I also want you to talk to this attorney. Her name is Rachel Kim, and she specializes in wartime restitution cases. She's handled some of the largest recovered art collections in recent years, and she'll know how to protect you legally from anything Victoria might try. The business card felt heavy in my hand. Another step into a world I'd never known existed. 2 days ago I had been Elena Martinez, marketing coordinator and grieving daughter. Now I was the guardian of a multi-million-dollar collection of recovered war artifacts, the target of a woman whose family had participated in genocide, and the inheritor of a mission that connected me to survivors and victims across the globe. There's one more thing, Cooper said, pulling out a final document. I need you to know that your mother left something else behind, something Victoria didn't know about and couldn't destroy. He handed me a thick envelope, sealed and addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. My name was written across the front in Carmen's careful script, along with instructions. To be opened only by Elena Martinez, only after the truth about the collection has been revealed. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, written in my mother's voice, explaining everything Cooper had just told me but in her own words, with her own emotions and fears and hopes. She had known this day would come, had prepared for the moment when I would discover her secret mission. My dearest Elena, the letter began, if you are reading this, it means that the collection has been discovered and you now understand the responsibility I have carried for so many years. I never wanted to burden you with this knowledge while you were young, but I always knew that someday it would fall to you to finish what I started. She wrote about Rosa Goldstein, about the network of people who had helped smuggle the jewelry to America, about the decades of patient research that had allowed her to locate and acquire piece after piece of the scattered collection. She wrote about the families she had corresponded with, the survivors she had met, the children and grandchildren, who still hoped to recover some tangible connection to ancestors they had lost. I know this seems overwhelming, the letter continued, but you have something I never had. You have Detective Cooper, who understands the significance of this work. You have resources I never dreamed of having. And you have a strength that comes from knowing the truth, rather than guarding secrets. The letter went on for pages, providing names and contacts, explaining the significance of specific pieces, offering guidance for the work ahead. But it was the final paragraph that brought tears to my eyes. Victoria will try to stop you, Elena. She has suspected the truth for years, and she married your father specifically to gain access to this collection. She represents everything our family has fought against. The willingness to profit from others' suffering, the determination to bury the truth rather than face it. But you are stronger than her hatred, more determined than her grief. You carry forward not just my love, but the hopes of people who trusted their most precious possessions to strangers, believing that someday justice would prevail. I folded the letter carefully, understanding now that every choice my mother had made, every sacrifice and secret, had been leading to this moment. Victoria had tried to destroy more than jewelry. She had tried to bury history, to silence voices that had already been silenced once by her grandfather's generation. But she had failed, the collection had survived, the truth had emerged, and now the real work could begin. Not just returning stolen property to its rightful owners, but exposing the network of people who continued to benefit from wartime crimes, who married into families and assumed false identities to hide their connections to genocide. Cooper stood up, extending his hand to me. Elena, are you ready to change your life completely? Because once we start this process, there's no going back to being just another marketing coordinator in Portland. You're about to become the face of one of the most significant wartime restitution cases in recent history. I shook his hand, feeling the weight of my mother's mission settling onto my shoulders like a mantle of responsibility and purpose. I'm ready, but first I want to set a trap for Victoria. I want her to reveal herself completely before we expose the truth publicly. Cooper's eyes gleamed with interest. What did you have in mind? I thought about Victoria's arrogance, her confidence that she had successfully destroyed my mother's legacy. She had no idea that her carefully constructed false identity was about to crumble, no clue that the granddaughter of a Nazi war criminal was about to face justice for continuing her family's crimes. I want to invite her to coffee, I said. I want to tell her that I'm thinking of having the jewelry fragments appraised, just for insurance purposes. I want to watch her face when she realizes that her plan failed, that the evidence of her grandfather's crimes is about to become public knowledge. Cooper nodded slowly. That's dangerous, Elena. If she realizes the full scope of what we've discovered, she might become desperate. Desperate people do unpredictable things. Then we'll make sure we're prepared for anything she might try. But I want to give her the chance to confess, to admit what she did and why. I want her to face the truth about her family and her own choices. As I left Cooper's office that afternoon, carrying with me the weight of $12 million in recovered war artifacts and the knowledge that my stepmother was the granddaughter of a Nazi war criminal, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my mother's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond my own grief and loss. Victoria Hayes had tried to erase my mother's memory, to bury a collection that represented the hopes and dreams of Holocaust survivors. But she had underestimated the power of truth, the determination of people who refused to let history be rewritten by those who would prefer it forgotten. Tomorrow I would call Victoria and invite her to coffee. I would look into the eyes of a woman whose grandfather had stolen these very pieces from Jewish families, who had married my father specifically to gain access to my mother's collection, who had systematically destroyed what she believed was evidence of her family's crime. And then, when the moment was right, I would show her exactly how wrong she had been about the powerless stepdaughter who was supposed to disappear quietly into grief and defeat. Some legacies are too important to be destroyed by hatred. Some truths are too powerful to be buried by lies. The war Victoria's grandfather had fought was over. But the battle for justice, for remembrance, for the voices of those who could no longer speak for themselves, that battle was just beginning. The coffee shop I chose for my meeting with Victoria was deliberately public, a busy place in the Pearl District where conversations could be overheard and witnessed. Detective Cooper had insisted on positioning himself at a nearby table, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid detection. His colleague from the Portland Police Department sat at the counter, posing as a customer reading the morning paper. I arrived 20 minutes early, ordering my usual latte and selecting a table near the window where the afternoon light would illuminate Victoria's face clearly. Cooper had given me a small recording device, virtually invisible when clipped to my jacket, along with strict instructions about how to guide the conversation without appearing to interrogate. Victoria swept through the door at exactly 3 o'clock, her designer handbag swinging confidently at her side, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the October rain outside. She moved through the crowded coffee shop like someone accustomed to having spaces clear for her passage, and I wondered how I had never noticed the arrogance that radiated from her every gesture. "Elena, darling," she said, settling into the chair across from me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You sounded so upset on the phone yesterday. I hope you're not still dwelling on that unfortunate incident with those old trinkets." The casual dismissal of my mother's jewelry as trinkets was exactly the opening I needed. I took a sip of my latte, studying Victoria's face over the rim of my cup. Up close, I could see tension lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal, a tightness in her jaw that suggested she wasn't as confident as she appeared. "Actually, that's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the jewelry just being costume pieces and sentimental clutter. You were right that I should be more practical about these things." Victoria's smile became more genuine, predatory in its satisfaction. "I'm so glad you're finally seeing reason. Your mother was a lovely woman, but she did have a tendency to assign significance to objects that really weren't worth keeping. It's natural to want to cling to memories, but at some point, we have to face reality." "Exactly," I agreed, watching her carefully. "So I decided to take your advice and have the fragments appraised. Just for insurance purposes, you understand. To document what was lost in the unfortunate accident." The change in Victoria's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The casual confidence flickered for just a moment, replaced by something sharper and more calculating. "An appraisal, Elena, that seems like an unnecessary expense. As I said, those pieces weren't valuable. You'd just be throwing money away." "Oh, it wasn't expensive at all," I said cheerfully. "I found this wonderful appraiser, actually a retired detective who specializes in estate jewelry. Detective Cooper. He was very thorough, very professional. He even did some research into the history of the piece." Victoria's coffee cup clinked against the saucer as she set it down, and I caught the slight tremor in her hand before she clasped both hands together on the table. "Research? What kind of research could there be about costume jewelry?" "That's what I thought," I said, leaning forward slightly. But apparently my mother's collection was more interesting than either of us realized. Detective Cooper recognized some of the pieces, said they matched descriptions in his databases. Something about wartime artifacts and displaced property. The color drained from Victoria's face so completely that her foundation looked garish against her suddenly pale skin. She reached for her coffee again, but her hand was shaking too obviously to complete the motion gracefully. "Wartime artifacts?" she repeated, her voice carefully controlled. "That's ridiculous. Your mother was born in What could she possibly have known about wartime anything?" "That's exactly what I said," I agreed. But Detective Cooper explained that many families have pieces that were passed down, sometimes with stories, sometimes without. He said it's actually quite common for people to inherit jewelry without knowing its full history. Victoria's breathing had become shallow, and she kept glancing toward the door as if calculating escape routes. "Elena, I think this detective might be taking advantage of your grief. These people prey on emotional vulnerability, convince you that ordinary objects are priceless treasures. It's a common scam." Is it? I asked innocently, because he seemed very knowledgeable. He showed me photographs, documentation, even contacted some international organizations that track this kind of thing. The German government, some commission about Holocaust-era insurance claims. Very official, very legitimate. The mention of German government involvement made Victoria flinch visibly. She pressed her lips together so tightly they disappeared entirely, and I could see a pulse beating rapidly in her temple. Holocaust, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena, you can't possibly believe that your mother was involved with anything like that. She was a school teacher from California. From a school teacher whose family had connections she never talked about, I corrected gently. Detective Cooper found records, Victoria names, dates, documentation that traces several pieces in my mother's collection back to Jewish families in Vienna. Families who lost everything during the war. Victoria stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing attention from other customers. She sat back down quickly, but not before I saw the panic in her eyes. This is absurd, she said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Your mother collected jewelry from estate sales and pawn shops. Any connection to wartime events would be purely coincidental. Would it? I asked, pulling out my phone and scrolling to a photograph Cooper had provided. Because this seems like more than coincidence. I turned the screen toward Victoria, showing her the black and white photograph of Rosa Goldstein, wearing my mother's emerald ring. Victoria stared at the image for several seconds, her face cycling through expressions of recognition, fear, and something that looked almost like rage. Where did you get this? She demanded. Detective Cooper's research. This is Rosa Goldstein, my mother's great aunt. She was an art dealer in Vienna before the war, before she had to flee and leave everything behind. I paused, studying Victoria's reaction. The thing is, Victoria, Detective Cooper doesn't just specialize in jewelry appraisal. He also investigates art theft, war crimes, families who collaborated with the Nazi regime. Victoria's face went from pale to gray, and for a moment, I thought she might actually faint. She gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles went white. You don't know what you're talking about, she whispered. You're playing with forces you don't understand. Elena, some things should stay buried, should they? I leaned back in my chair, maintaining eye contact. Because Detective Cooper has been very thorough in his research. He's not just interested in my mother's jewelry, Victoria. He's also been investigating you. The words hung between us like a blade. Victoria's carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time, and I could see the woman underneath, the one who had calculated every move for the past 3 years, who had married my father specifically to gain access to my mother's collection. Me, she said, attempting to laugh, but the sound came out hollow and forced. What could there possibly be to investigate about me? I'm just a woman who fell in love with your father. Are you? I asked quietly. Because according to Detective Cooper's research, you're actually Victoria Schmidt, not Victoria Hayes. Your grandfather Klaus Schmidt worked for the Nazi regime during the war, specifically in the division responsible for confiscating Jewish property. The accusation hit Victoria like a physical blow. She actually recoiled in her chair, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. For several seconds she seemed unable to form words. That's impossible, she finally managed. My family came to America generations ago. We're old American stock, established families with deep roots. No, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. Your grandfather was Klaus Schmidt, who fled to America after the war under false documentation. He changed his name, created a new identity, but the records still exist. Victoria, the German government, has been very cooperative in helping Detective Cooper trace war criminals and their descendants. Victoria's hands were shaking so violently now that she had to clasp them together to hide the tremor. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool October afternoon. Even if that were true, she said desperately, what does it have to do with me? I can't be held responsible for things that happened before I was born. Can't you? I asked, because Detective Cooper thinks your destruction of my mother's jewelry wasn't random spy. He thinks you recognized the pieces, understood their significance, and systematically destroyed them to prevent the truth from coming out. Victoria's eyes darted around the coffee shop, and I could see her calculating, weighing her options. The confident woman who had humiliated me in my own childhood bedroom was gone, replaced by someone cornered and desperate. You're making wild accusations based on the fantasies of some retired cop who's probably desperate for attention, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Your father will never believe this nonsense. Won't he? I pulled out another photograph, this one showing Victoria at a previous social event, standing next to a man Detective Cooper had identified as a known collector of Nazi artifacts. Because Detective Cooper has been very thorough, Victoria. He's found your connections to people who deal in stolen wartime art, your membership in organizations that specialize in concealing war criminal identities, your carefully constructed false background. Victoria stared at the photograph, and I saw the exact moment when she realized her carefully built life was collapsing around her. The mask of respectability she had worn for 3 years slipped completely away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. You stupid little girl, she hissed, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than any scream. You have no idea what you're dealing with. You think this is about jewelry, about your precious mother's memory. This is about survival, Victoria said, leaning forward across the table, about families who did what they had to do during wartime, who built new lives in America, who deserved to be left in peace. Your mother was a naive idealist, who thought she could right historical wrongs by playing amateur detective. So you knew, I said, triumph and horror warring in my voice. You knew exactly what my mother was doing. Victoria's laugh was bitter and sharp. Of course I knew. Do you think I married your boring father for love? I spent 2 years researching your family before I ever introduced myself to Thomas. I knew about Carmen's collection, about her pathetic mission to reunite stolen property with long-dead victims. The confession was exactly what Detective Cooper had hoped for, but hearing it spoken aloud was still shocking in its casual cruelty. Victoria had orchestrated her entire relationship with my father as part of a calculated plan to destroy evidence of her grandfather's crime. You married my father to get access to my mother's jewelry, I said, needing to hear her admit it completely. I married your father to protect my family's legacy, Victoria corrected. Klaus Schmidt was a patriot who served his country during wartime. He deserved to live out his life in peace, not to be hunted by Jewish revenge fantasies and liberal guilt. The anti-Semitism in her words was naked and undisguised, the ideology that had driven her grandfather's generation now flowering again in his I felt sick listening to her, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. The pretense was finally over. We both knew exactly who we were and what we were fighting for. So you destroyed my mother's collection to protect your grandfather's reputation. I destroyed evidence of crimes that were never proven, allegations made by people with an agenda, Victoria said firmly. Your mother collected stolen property, Elena. She was a criminal herself, and you're continuing her crimes by working with these so-called investigators. The twisted logic was breathtaking. In Victoria's mind, the victims of genocide were the criminals, and the people trying to return stolen property to its rightful owners were the ones breaking the law. The jewelry isn't gone, Victoria, I said quietly. Some pieces survived your destruction. Detective Cooper has them, along with full documentation of their provenance and ownership history. Victoria's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: disbelief, rage, calculation, and finally a kind of cold determination that made me suddenly afraid. How many pieces? She asked. Enough, I said. Enough to prove everything Detective Cooper suspected about your grandfather, about you, about why you really married my father. Victoria was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the busy Portland street. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and measured, which was somehow more terrifying than her earlier panic. Elena, you're going to stop this investigation immediately. You're going to tell Detective Cooper that you've decided not to pursue the matter, that you want to let sleeping dogs lie. You're going to drop this entire thing and never speak of it again. Am I? I asked. And why would I do that? Victoria's smile was cold and sharp as a blade. Because if you don't, I'm going to tell your father that you've been stealing from him, using his credit cards to fund a drug habit, that you've been lying about your job and living situation. I'll provide documentation, receipts, witness statement. I'll convince him that your grief over your mother has driven you to become unstable, dangerous, someone who needs to be committed for psychiatric evaluation. The threat was so comprehensive, so well thought out, that I realized she had been planning this contingency for some time. Victoria had prepared for the possibility that her plan might be discovered, and she had weapons ready to use against me. He would never believe that, I said, but even as I spoke, I wondered if it was true. Victoria had 3 years to poison my father's mind, to isolate him from me, to make him dependent on her version of reality. Wouldn't he, Victoria? A grieving daughter who's been acting erratically since her mother's death, who's now claiming that costume jewelry is worth millions of dollars, who's working with mysterious detectives on elaborate conspiracy theories about Nazi war criminals. How does that sound to a man who just wants peace in his life? She pulled out her phone and showed me the screen. I've already started documenting your erratic behavior, Elena. Photos, recordings, witness statements from people who will swear that you've been acting unstable, making wild accusations, living in fantasy worlds. The setup was masterful and terrifying. Victoria had been preparing for this confrontation, building a case against my sanity that could discredit anything I might say about her or her family's history. You're threatening to have me committed to a mental institution? I'm offering you a choice, Victoria said pleasantly. Walk away from this investigation, convince Detective Cooper to drop the matter, and go back to your quiet little life, or continue down this path and discover what happens to people who interfere with things that don't concern them. I stared at her across the table, seeing clearly for the first time the woman my father had married. Not just someone carrying on her grandfather's work, but someone who had refined his methods, who used manipulation and psychological warfare instead of outright violence, but with the same goal, silencing voices that might speak inconvenient truths. What if I refuse? I asked. Victoria's smile widened. Then tomorrow morning, your father will receive a call from a very concerned psychiatric professional, who's been monitoring your deteriorating mental health. By afternoon, you'll be under involuntary commitment for evaluation. By the end of the week, Detective Cooper will receive documentation proving that you've been fabricating evidence, forging documents, and conducting a harassment campaign against an innocent family. She leaned back in her chair, supremely confident once again. The choice is yours, Elena, but choose carefully. Some games have consequences that can't be undone. I looked across the table at the woman who had destroyed my mother's jewelry, who had married my father under false pretenses, who was now threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent to protect her grandfather's war crime. And I realized that Victoria had made one crucial mistake in her calculations. She had assumed I was still the grieving, powerless stepdaughter who had stood silently in my childhood bedroom while she scattered my mother's pearls across the floor. But Detective Cooper's revelations had changed me, had shown me that I carried forward a legacy of people who had refused to be silenced by bullies and tyrants. You know what, Victoria? I said, standing up slowly. I think I'll take my chances. Victoria's confident expression faltered. Elena, you don't understand what you're risking. No, I said, pulling out my phone and showing her the recording app that had been running throughout our conversation. I don't think you understand what you've just confessed to. The color drained from Victoria's face as she realized she had been recorded admitting to marrying my father under false pretenses, to destroying my mother's jewelry deliberately, to knowing about her grandfather's war crimes, and to threatening me with false psychiatric commitment. That recording is illegal, she said desperately. Oregon is a two-party consent state. You can't record me without my permission. I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. Actually, Detective Cooper Oregon allows one-party consent for recording conversations when there's reason to suspect criminal activity, and threatening someone with false psychiatric commitment definitely qualifies as criminal activity. Victoria's mouth opened and closed silently, her carefully planned trap collapsing around her. She had been so focused on controlling me through fear and manipulation that she hadn't considered the possibility that I might be prepared for her threat. This isn't over, she said, standing up so quickly that she knocked over her coffee cup, sending brown liquid spreading across the white tablecloth. You have no idea who you're dealing with, what kind of people you're challenging. Actually, I said calmly, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The granddaughter of a Nazi war criminal who's been living under a false identity, who married my father to destroy evidence of her family's crimes, and who just threatened to have me forcibly committed to a mental institution to protect her secret. Other customers in the coffee shop were staring now, drawn by Victoria's raised voice and agitated movements. She looked around wildly, realizing that her public breakdown was being witnessed by dozens of potential witnesses. You'll regret this, she hissed, grabbing her purse and backing toward the door. My family has resources, connections, ways of dealing with problems that you can't imagine. Is that another threat? I asked, making sure my voice carried clearly through the quiet coffee shop. Because Detective Cooper is going to be very interested in hearing about your family's resources and connections. Victoria turned and practically ran from the coffee shop, leaving behind her spilled coffee and the last remnants of her carefully constructed facade. Through the window, I watched her stumble on the sidewalk, her usual grace replaced by the desperate movements of someone whose world was collapsing. Detective Cooper approached my table moments after Victoria disappeared from sight, his expression grim but satisfied. "Did you get what we need?" I held up my phone, showing him the recording that had captured Victoria's complete confession. Her knowledge of the jewelry's significance, her admission that she married my father to gain access to my mother's collection, her threats against me, even her defense of her grandfather's war crimes. Cooper nodded grimly. "And now she knows that we know everything. That makes her dangerous, Elena. People like Victoria don't surrender quietly when their secrets are exposed." I looked out at the busy Portland street where my stepmother had disappeared, knowing that our confrontation had been only the beginning. Victoria had spent 3 years carefully constructing her false life, and she wouldn't let it be destroyed without a fight. But for the first time since my mother's death, I felt strong enough for whatever battle was coming. The scared, grieving daughter, who had watched helplessly as Victoria destroyed her mother's jewelry, was gone. In her place was someone who understood exactly what she was fighting for and why it mattered. The war Victoria's grandfather had fought might have ended in 1945, but the battle for justice, for truth, for the voices of those who could no longer speak for themselves, that battle was far from over, and I was ready to finish what my mother had started. The first sign that Victoria was escalating her campaign came at 6 o'clock the next morning, when my phone rang with a call from my father. I had been awake since 4, unable to sleep after the confrontation with Victoria, pacing my apartment and rehearsing the conversation I knew we needed to have. "Elena, we need to talk immediately," Thomas said without preamble. His voice carried a tone I hadn't heard since my teenage years when I'd been caught sneaking out past curfew. "I'm coming to your apartment. Dad, I can explain everything," I began, but he cut me off. "I don't want explanations over the phone. Victoria has told me some very disturbing things about your recent behavior, and I need to see for myself what's going on with you." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone and realizing that Victoria had moved faster than Detective Cooper had anticipated. She was already implementing her threat to poison my father's mind against me, probably having spent the entire night crafting her version of events. I called Cooper immediately, despite the early hour. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert and professional despite having been woken from sleep. "Elena, what's happened?" "Victoria's already gotten to my father. He's on his way over here, and from his tone she's convinced him that I'm having some kind of breakdown." I paced to my living room window, watching the empty street and waiting for my father's car to appear. "This is exactly what we expected," Cooper said calmly. "Victoria knows her confession yesterday puts her in serious legal jeopardy, so she's trying to discredit you before you can present the evidence against her. Are you prepared for what your father might say?" "I don't think anyone can be prepared for their father to think they're mentally ill," I admitted. "But I have the recording, the documentation you provided, the photographs, the evidence speaks for itself. Evidence only matters if people are willing to listen to it," Cooper warned. "Victoria has had 3 years to establish herself as the rational, stable influence in your father's life, while positioning you as the grieving daughter who never properly processed your mother's death. She's going to use every psychological manipulation she can think of." Through my window I saw my father's silver sedan pulling into the parking garage beneath my building. Even from 5 stories up, I could see the tension in his shoulders as he got out of the car. "He's here," I told Cooper. "Wish me luck." "Elena," Cooper's voice grew serious, "remember that your father is a victim too. Victoria manipulated him just as much as she manipulated everyone else. Try to help him see the truth without attacking his judgment. He's going to feel foolish enough when he realizes how thoroughly he's been deceived." When my father knocked on my apartment door 10 minutes later, I took a deep breath and opened it to find a man I barely recognized. Thomas Hayes had always been distinguished, the kind of architect who inspired confidence in wealthy clients through his combination of artistic vision and practical reliability. But the man standing in my hallway looked haggard, older than his 58 years, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them. "Dad," I said gently, stepping aside to let him enter. "I'm glad you came, we need to talk." He walked into my living room but didn't sit down, instead moving to the window where he stood with his back to me, staring out at the Portland skyline. "Victoria tells me you've been making wild accusations about her family, claiming that costume jewelry is worth millions of dollars. working with detectives on elaborate conspiracy theories. His voice was flat, exhausted. She says you recorded a private conversation without her permission, that you've been harassing her with stories about Nazi war criminals and stolen art. Dad, please sit down. Let me show you what I've discovered about Mom's jewelry, about Victoria's real identity. He turned to face me, and I was shocked to see tears in his eyes. Elena, your mother has been gone for 5 years. 5 years. At some point you have to let go of the past and accept that she's not coming back. This isn't about bringing Mom back, I said carefully. This is about honoring what she was trying to accomplish, about finishing something important she started. Your mother was a second-grade teacher, Thomas said firmly. She collected jewelry from estate sales and pawn shops, because she liked pretty things and we couldn't afford expensive pieces when we were starting out. There was nothing secret or mysterious about it. She wasn't some kind of undercover art detective. I pulled out the folder Detective Cooper had given me, opening it on my coffee table. Dad, please look at this. These are photographs, documentation, official records from the German government and International Holocaust Organization. Thomas glanced at the papers but didn't move closer to examine them. Victoria warned me, you might have forged documents. She says there are people who prey on grieving families, who convince them that ordinary objects are priceless treasures. Victoria warned you. I asked, feeling anger rise in my chest. Dad, Victoria destroyed Mom's jewelry. She admitted it to me yesterday. She told me she married you specifically to get access to Mom's collection. That's ridiculous, Thomas said, but something in his voice suggested uncertainty. Victoria fell in love with me. We met at the gallery opening. We started talking about art and architecture. We discovered we had so much in common. Did you meet at a gallery opening? I asked quietly. Or did she approach you there, knowing you would be there, having researched your schedule and interests beforehand? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him thinking back to that first meeting, perhaps noticing details he had overlooked at the time. Even if that were true, he said finally, it doesn't mean anything sinister. Maybe she was interested in me and found a way to meet me. People do that all the time. I pressed play on my phone, letting Victoria's recorded voice fill the apartment. Of course I knew. Do you think I married your boring father for love? I spent 2 years researching your family before I ever introduced myself to Thomas. Thomas stood frozen as Victoria's confession continued, her admission that she had known about my mother's collection, that she had married him as part of a calculated plan to destroy evidence of her grandfather's crime. When the recording ended, he sank into my armchair as if his legs could no longer support him. That's not possible, he whispered. She loves me. We've built a life together. She's been nothing but supportive and caring since Carmen died. Dad, look at these photographs. I knelt beside his chair, showing him the image of Rosa Goldstein wearing my mother's emerald ring. This is Mom's great-aunt, photographed in Vienna in 1943 before she had to flee the Nazis. Mom spent years tracking down pieces from Rosa's collection, trying to return stolen property to Holocaust survivors. Thomas studied the photograph with the trained eye of someone accustomed to examining historical architectural plans. I could see him recognizing the craftsmanship of the jewelry, the quality that suggested these pieces were far more valuable than costume jewelry from estate sales. This woman looks like Carmen, he said softly. The bone structure, the eyes. Because she was family Mom never told us about because she was protecting their story until she could complete her mission. I showed him page after page of documentation, survivor testimonies, insurance claims, pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture of systematic theft, and decades of patient recovery work. And Victoria knew about all this. Her grandfather was Klaus Schmidt, one of the Nazi officials responsible for confiscating Jewish property during the war. Victoria recognized the significance of Mom's collection, and spent 3 years planning how to destroy it. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, studying the documents with increasing comprehension. As an architect, he understood the importance of documentation, the way individual pieces of evidence combine to create an undeniable structure of truth. The night she destroyed the jewelry, he said finally, I wasn't even home. Victoria said she was just cleaning your old room, making space for the home office we'd discussed. When I saw the broken pieces, she told me it was an accident, that she'd knocked over a jewelry box while dust. It wasn't an accident, Dad. It was systematic destruction designed to eliminate evidence of war crimes. Thomas stood up abruptly, walking back to the window. Elena, if this is true, if I've been living with someone who deliberately deceived me, who married me under false pretenses, who destroyed your mother's legacy, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. You're not responsible for being manipulated, I said gently, remembering Cooper's advice. Victoria is skilled at deception. She spent 2 years studying our family, learning how to present herself as exactly what you needed after Mom died. But I should have seen it, Thomas said bitterly. I should have questioned why she was so eager to erase every trace of Carmen from our home, why she discouraged me from talking about your mother, why she always found excuses to prevent you from visiting. I joined him at the window, standing beside the father I hadn't really talked to in 3 years. She knew exactly how to exploit your grief, Dad. She made forgetting seem like healing, made moving forward seem like strength. What kind of man does that make me? Thomas asked. That I was so desperate to stop hurting, that I let someone manipulate me into betraying my first wife's memory, into pushing away my own daughter. It makes you human, I said firmly. It makes you someone who loved Mom so much that losing her nearly destroyed you. Victoria used that love against you, but it doesn't diminish what you and Mom had together. Thomas was quiet for a long time, processing not just the evidence I'd shown him, but the implications for everything he thought he knew about his life for the past 3 years. What happens now? She asked finally. Now we expose the truth. Detective Cooper is working with international organizations to return Mom's jewelry to the families it was stolen from. Victoria will face criminal charges for destroying evidence of war crimes, for marriage fraud, for threatening me with false psychiatric commitment. And us? Thomas asked, looking at me directly for the first time since he'd arrived. Can we fix what she broke between us? I felt tears prick my eyes at the question, at the hope in his voice that suggested the father I remembered might still exist underneath 3 years of Victoria's manipulation. I'd like to try, I said honestly, but it's going to take time, Dad. Victoria didn't just destroy Mom's jewelry. She poisoned our relationship, made us suspicious of each other, convinced us both that grief was something to be ashamed of rather than worked through together. Thomas nodded slowly. She told me you blamed me for Carmen's death, that you resented me for remarrying, that spending time with you just made me more depressed. She told me you wanted to forget Mom entirely, that I reminded you of everything you wanted to leave behind, that my grief was selfish and destructive. We stood there looking at each other, realizing how thoroughly Victoria had orchestrated our estrangement, how she had used our love for Carmen to drive us apart rather than bring us together. I never stopped missing your mother, Thomas said quietly. I never stopped loving her. Victoria convinced me that holding on to those feelings was unhealthy, that I needed to focus entirely on the future. Missing Mom wasn't unhealthy, I said. Trying to erase her was unhealthy. She deserved to be remembered, honored, celebrated for the amazing woman she was and the important work she was doing. Thomas pulled out his phone, staring at it as if it were a weapon he needed to disarm. I need to confront Victoria. I need to hear her admit what she's done. Need to understand how someone could be so calculating, so cruel. Dad, Detective Cooper warned me that Victoria might be dangerous when cornered. Her confession yesterday showed someone who's willing to do whatever it takes to protect her secret. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we let the professionals handle this. Cooper has contacts in law enforcement, federal agencies that investigate war crimes and art theft. Victoria isn't just a woman who destroyed some jewelry. She's part of a network that's been concealing Nazi war criminal identities for decades. Thomas studied the documentation again, his architect's mind grasping the scope and complexity of what we were dealing with. This is bigger than just our family, isn't it? Much bigger. Mom spent years researching not just the jewelry but the people who helped steal it. The networks that helped war criminals escape justice. The families who continue to profit from genocide. Victoria represents a system that's been operating for 70 years. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Detective Cooper's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a sense of foreboding. Elena, we have a problem. Victoria didn't go home last night. Her car is missing from your father's house, and neighbors reported seeing her loading suitcases around midnight. I looked at my father, seeing my own realization reflected in his face. Victoria had realized her position was untenable and was attempting to flee before law enforcement could arrest her. Where would she go? I asked Cooper. We're checking airline records, but someone with her resources probably has multiple false identities prepared. This is what her grandfather's generation did when the war ended, and Victoria has had decades to refine their methods. Thomas took the phone from my hand. Detective Cooper, this is Thomas Hayes, Elena's father. I need to know what we're dealing with here. Is my daughter in danger? I could hear Cooper's voice through the phone explaining the federal agencies that were now involved, the international scope of the investigation, the possibility that Victoria was part of a larger network of people hiding war criminal identities. Hayes, Cooper said finally, your wife wasn't just collecting jewelry. She was conducting one of the most significant private war crimes investigations in recent history. And your current wife has been working just as hard to cover up those crimes. People who profit from genocide don't surrender quietly when they're exposed. Thomas handed the phone back to me, his face pale but determined. Elena, what do you need from me? I need you to help Detective Cooper access Victoria's belongings, her papers, anything that might reveal where she's gone or who she's been working with. I paused, seeing the pain in his eyes at the mention of searching through Victoria's possessions. And I need you to accept that the woman you married never existed. Victoria Hayes was a carefully constructed identity designed to gain your trust and destroy Mom's work. The woman I fell in love with was a lie. Everything about her was a lie, Dad. Her background, her personality, her feelings for you. She studied you for 2 years before approaching you, learned exactly how to present herself as what you needed. Thomas was quiet for several minutes, processing the complete destruction of what he had thought was a loving relationship. There's something else, he said finally. Victoria has been encouraging me to update my will to make her the primary beneficiary of my estate. She said it was just practical planning, that married couples should protect each other. When was this? Last month. She brought home papers from her attorney, said it was just a formality but that we should handle it quickly in case something happened to me. I felt cold understanding wash over me. Victoria hadn't just been working to destroy my mother's jewelry collection. She had been positioning herself to inherit my father's considerable assets, probably as part of an exit strategy she had been planning since their marriage. Dad, you need to call your attorney immediately. If Victoria has access to your accounts, your properties, anything valuable, she could be liquidating those assets right now to fund her escape. Thomas was already dialing his attorney's number, but I could see in his expression that he feared we were too late, that Victoria's 3-year plan had been more comprehensive than any of us had realized. As he spoke to his attorney, I called Detective Cooper back to report this new development. Victoria hadn't just been hiding her identity and destroying evidence of war crimes. She had been systematically positioning herself to steal my father's life savings as part of her escape plan. Cooper, Victoria may have access to my father's financial account. She convinced him to update his will, probably has authorization on bank accounts, investment portfolios. We're already on it, Cooper said grimly. Federal agents are freezing all accounts associated with Victoria's known identities. But if she's been planning this for years, she probably has resources we don't know about. Thomas ended his call with his attorney, his face. She emptied 3 accounts yesterday afternoon, transferred nearly $400,000 to offshore accounts. My attorney is trying to trace the transfers, but Victoria apparently had this planned very carefully. So Victoria hadn't just been destroying my mother's legacy to protect her grandfather's crimes. She had been conducting a long-term financial fraud, using marriage as a cover for theft on a massive scale. Dad, I'm sorry you were deceived. Sorry you've lost so much money. Sorry that someone used your grief against you so cruelly. Thomas shook his head. The money doesn't matter. What matters is that we stop her from destroying anyone else's life, from silencing any more voices that deserve to be heard. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since before my mother's death, the determined focus that had built his architectural firm from nothing. Elena, what can I do to help? How do we make sure Victoria faces justice for what she's done to our family, to your mother's memory, to all those families whose stolen property she tried to keep hidden? For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had my father back. Not the broken man who had been vulnerable to Victoria's manipulation, but the strong, principled person who had raised me to believe in justice and truth. We helped Detective Cooper and the federal agents track her down. We make sure every document, every record, every piece of evidence is preserved. And we continue Mom's work of returning those jewelry pieces to their rightful families. Thomas nodded firmly. And we make sure the world knows what your mother was trying to accomplish, what kind of woman she really was. Outside my apartment window, Portland was waking up to another ordinary day, people heading to work and school without knowing that in their city, one of the largest war crimes investigations in recent history was unfolding. Victoria was out there somewhere, probably assuming that her carefully constructed escape plan would allow her to disappear as successfully as her grandfather had 70 years ago. But this wasn't. Communication networks were global, financial systems were tracked, and the victims of war crimes had descendants who refused to let their families' stories be forgotten. My phone rang again, this time with a call from an unknown number with an international prefix. Martinez, this is Sarah Goldstein calling from Vienna. Detective Cooper contacted our family about my great-grandmother Rosa's jewelry collection. I understand you've been working to locate pieces that were stolen during the war. I looked at my father, seeing my own sense of purpose reflected in his eyes. Victoria might have escaped for now, but she hadn't succeeded in silencing the voices she'd tried to bury. Yes, I told Sarah Goldstein. I've been continuing my mother's work, and I think we have some pieces that belong to your family. 6 months after Victoria's desperate flight from Portland, I stood in the ballroom of the Austrian Cultural Center in Vienna, surrounded by faces that carried echoes of my mother's features. The event was being called the largest wartime art restitution ceremony in recent history, and at the center of it all was my mother's jewelry collection, each piece finally returning to the families it had been stolen from 70 years ago. Sarah Goldstein approached me carrying a small velvet box, tears streaming down her cheeks. Inside was Rosa Goldstein's emerald ring, the one I had watched Victoria try to destroy in my childhood bedroom. Detective Cooper's team had managed to restore it completely, and now it was going home to Rosa's great-granddaughter. Your mother was a hero, Sarah said, embracing me warmly. For 30 years we searched for any trace of my great-grandmother's collection. We thought it was lost forever, that the Nazis had succeeded in erasing that part of our family history. Around the room, similar scenes were playing out as families reunited with precious objects they had never expected to see again. A silver menorah that had belonged to the Weiss family was being presented to elderly Joseph Weiss, who remembered his grandmother lighting it every Friday night before the family was forced to flee Berlin. The pearl bracelet my mother had worn on her wedding day, originally owned by the Rosenberg family, was being given to young Rebecca Rosenberg, who clutched it to her chest as if it contained the spirits of ancestors she had never met. My father stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders, both of us overwhelmed by the magnitude of what my mother had accomplished in her quiet, methodical way. Thomas had thrown himself into understanding Carmen's mission with the same dedication he brought to his architectural projects, and in the past 6 months, he had helped Detective Cooper trace connections between stolen artifacts and their rightful owners across 3 continents. Carmen would be so proud, he whispered to me as we watched an elderly man weeping over a pocket watch that had belonged to his father. Detective Cooper joined us, carrying a thick folder that contained the final documentation of Victoria's crimes and capture. She had been arrested 3 weeks ago in Buenos Aires, attempting to board a flight to Paraguay under a false identity. The International Task Force tracking Nazi war criminal networks had been monitoring her movements since her flight from Portland, and her attempt to liquidate stolen assets had led them directly to her location. The extradition hearing is scheduled for next month, Cooper told. She's facing charges in 3 countries for art theft, marriage fraud, identity fraud, and obstruction of justice in war crimes investigations. Victoria's arrest had revealed the scope of her deception far beyond what any of us had imagined. She wasn't just the granddaughter of a Nazi war criminal. She was part of an active network that had been helping war criminals and their descendants hide their identities and liquidate stolen assets for decades. Her marriage to my father had been just one operation in a larger criminal enterprise that spanned generations and continents. Any word on the missing funds from Dad's accounts? Actually, yet. The Buenos Aires authorities recovered most of the money Victoria stole from your father, along with documentation that leads us to believe she's been running similar scams on other widowed men across the country. Your father wasn't her first victim. Thomas's jaw tightened at this news. In the months since Victoria's true identity had been exposed, he had struggled with feelings of foolishness and betrayal, but learning that he was one of many victims had somehow made it easier for him to forgive himself. Elena Hoffman, a representative from the World Jewish Congress, approached our small group carrying a beautifully bound book. Miss Martinez, I wanted to present you with this before the ceremony concluded. It's a complete record of your mother's collection and the families each piece has been returned to. We're calling it the Carmen Martinez Memorial Archive. I opened the book carefully, seeing my mother's photograph on the first page, alongside a tribute that described her as a quiet hero whose 20-year mission to return stolen property to Holocaust survivors represents one of the most significant individual contributions to war crimes justice in recent history. There's something else, Dr. Hoffman continued. The families whose property your mother recovered have established a foundation in her name, the Carmen Martinez Foundation for Holocaust Education and Remembrance. They want you to serve as its director. The offer was both overwhelming and perfect. My mother had spent her life teaching children while secretly working to educate the world about the importance of remembering historical injustice. Continuing her work through a foundation that bore her name felt like the ultimate completion of her mission. I would be honored, I said, thinking about how my mother would have reacted to seeing her quiet work transformed into an international movement for justice and remembrance. As the ceremony concluded and families began to disperse, each carrying precious pieces of their heritage that had been lost and found again, I realized that Victoria's attempt to destroy my mother's legacy had actually amplified it beyond anything Carmen could have imagined. The international attention surrounding the case had brought together Holocaust survivors, war crimes investigators, and justice advocates from around the world. Sarah Goldstein approached me one final time before leaving for the airport. "Elena, I need you to know something. When my great-grandmother Rosa was forced to flee Vienna, she left behind a letter for her descendants. She wrote that she trusted her jewelry to friends, hoping that someday her family would reclaim it. But she also wrote that if her collection helped other families recover their own lost treasures, that would be an even greater victory." She handed me a photocopy of Rosa's letter, written in careful German script that had been translated into English. "Your mother didn't just return our jewelry to us, she fulfilled Rosa's deepest wish that her collection would serve a purpose greater than any individual family's needs." Reading Rosa's words, I understood that my mother's mission had been guided by something beyond simple justice. She had been carrying forward a philosophy that saw individual acts of recovery as part of a larger commitment to ensuring that the voices silenced by hatred would never be forgotten. The flight back to Portland gave me time to process everything that had changed in 6 months. Victoria was facing decades in prison, her network of accomplices was being systematically dismantled, and my father and I had rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of shared purpose rather than shared greed. But more than that, I had discovered that my mother's quiet life had been anything but ordinary. Carmen Martinez had been a woman who believed that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied, that patient work could accomplish what dramatic gestures could not, and that teaching children to read was entirely compatible with teaching the world to remember. Thomas met me at the Portland airport, and as we drove through the familiar streets of our city, he told me about the changes he was making to his architectural firm. "I'm establishing a pro bono division that will design Holocaust memorials and educational centers," he explained. Carmen always said that architecture should serve a purpose beyond just creating beautiful spaces. "I think it's time I started building monuments to memory instead of just monuments to wealth." We stopped at Riverside Cemetery where my mother was buried, carrying flowers and a copy of the book that documented her collection and its return to rightful owner. Carmen's simple headstone, which had always seemed inadequate to mark the life of such an extraordinary woman, now felt appropriately modest for someone who had preferred to let her actions speak louder than any monument. "I used to think Victoria was right about moving on from the past," Thomas said as we stood beside my mother's grave. "But I understand now that Carmen wasn't living in the past. She was working to heal it." I placed the flowers on my mother's grave and opened the book to show her photograph to the Portland sky. She would have loved seeing those families reunited with their jewelry. She would have been so proud that her work helped other people find their missing pieces. As we walked back to the car, my phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Cooper. "Just heard from Vienna. 2 more families have come forward with information about missing pieces from Rosa's collection. Think your mom might have found additional items we haven't discovered yet." The work was continuing, just as my mother would have wanted. Somewhere in Portland, probably in a safety deposit box or hidden in our old house, there were likely more pieces waiting to be returned to families who had never stopped hope. Victoria had tried to destroy my mother's legacy by scattering those pearls across my childhood bedroom floor, but she had failed to understand something fundamental about the nature of justice. Truth, like love, has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at destruction. Seeds scattered by hatred can still grow into flowers of remembrance and healing. 6 months ago I had been Elena Martinez, a grieving daughter who thought her stepmother was just spiteful and cruel. Today I was the director of an international foundation, the guardian of a mission that connected me to survivors and victims across the globe, and the daughter of a woman whose quiet heroism had touched hundreds of lives. Victoria Hayes, or Victoria Schmidt, or whatever her real name might have been, had spent 3 years trying to erase my mother's memory from our family's story. Instead, she had helped transform Carmen Martinez from a beloved but unknown second-grade teacher into an internationally recognized hero of Holocaust remembrance. The irony was perfect and complete. The granddaughter of a Nazi war criminal had become the unwitting catalyst for one of the most significant war crimes, justice victories in recent history. Her hatred had amplified the very voice she had tried to silence. That evening, as I sat in my apartment reviewing applications from students who wanted to intern with the Carmen Martinez Foundation, I thought about the conversation I had overheard my parents having when I was 12 years old. My mother had been telling my father about a student whose family had recently immigrated from Eastern Europe, a child who was struggling to learn English but who lit up when my mother showed her pictures from geography books. Every child deserves to know that their story matters, Carmen had said, that their family's history is worth preserving and sharing, not hiding or forgetting. At the time I had thought she was just talking about helping immigrant students feel welcome in American school. Now I understood that she had been articulating the philosophy that would guide her secret mission for the next 20 years. Every family deserved to have their stolen treasures returned. Every victim deserved to be remembered. Every voice that had been silenced deserved to be heard again. Victoria had called my mother's work Jewish revenge fantasies and liberal guilt, but revenge implies a desire to cause suffering, and guilt suggests shame about actions that should have been avoided. My mother's work had been motivated by neither. She had been driven by love, by a belief that healing was possible when truth replaced lies, when justice replaced theft, when remembrance replaced erasure. The Carmen Martinez Foundation would continue that work, expanding it beyond jewelry recovery to include educational programs, memorial projects and support for other families searching for lost pieces of their heritage. Victoria's attempt to bury the past had instead created a movement dedicated to ensuring that the past would never be forgotten. My phone rang with a call from Sarah Goldstein in Vienna. Elena, I wanted you to know that my great-grandmother's ring has already brought our family together in ways we never expected. My cousins in New York and Los Angeles are flying to Vienna next month for a reunion we're planning around Rosa's collection. Some of us have never met, but your mother's work has given us a reason to find each other. After the call ended, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, surrounded by documents and photographs that told the story of my mother's mission and Victoria's crime. Outside my window, Portland was settling into evening, a city full of people living ordinary lives, unaware that among them had lived a woman whose quiet heroism had changed the world. But perhaps that was exactly how Carmen Martinez would have wanted it. She had never sought recognition or glory. She had simply believed that small acts of justice, performed with patience and determination, could eventually grow into something larger and more significant than any individual gesture. Victoria had been wrong about everything. She had been wrong about my mother's jewelry being worthless trinkets. She had been wrong about grief making people weak and vulnerable. She had been wrong about the past being something that could be buried and forgotten. Most importantly, she had been wrong about love being a weakness that could be exploited. My father's love for my mother had made him vulnerable to Victoria's manipulation, but it had also given him the strength to rebuild our relationship and continue Carmen's mission. My love for my mother had made me an easy target for Victoria's cruelty, but it had also driven me to uncover truths that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. In the end, love had proven stronger than hatred, truth had proven more powerful than lies, and justice had proven more enduring than the crimes it sought to address. Victoria's carefully planned destruction had become the foundation for something beautiful and lasting. The pearls she had scattered across my childhood bedroom floor had been gathered up again, restored and returned to their rightful place in the world. Just like the voices she had tried to silence, just like the memories she had tried to erase, just like the love she had tried to destroy. Some things are too precious to be broken, too important to be buried, too powerful to be defeated by those who profit from hatred and fear. My mother had known that, had built her entire secret mission around that belief, and had been proven absolutely and completely right. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.